What is hip hop philosophy? That's a great question. First, you'd have to deconstruct what hip hop and what philosophy is. Hip hop emerges as a particular cultural expression used predominantly by African Americans, a lot of Latino youth that come up in the 80s. You'd have to go back to people like DJ Kool Herc, who was a DJ from Jamaica, who used a lot of the Jamaican traditions of DJing to create the first sounds. And sort of the tenets that come up today as we know them come through people like Afrika Bambaataa, who has sort of over the years come up with 5 main tenets of what hip-hop is, which is, knowledge of self, DJ, graffiti, the b-boy and b-girl, and those become some of the most tenets. Oh, and MCing becomes one of those big tenets. And over the years, those sort of value systems have sort of swapped where in the old days, the DJ and the b-boys were pretty much the big cultural exponents of the hip-hop culture. Today, as we know hip-hop, the MC is sort of the voice and the face of hip-hop as a culture. So when we talk about hip-hop philosophy, right, we think about philosophy as a cultural expression that some say starts with the Greeks, going back to people like Plato, Socrates, and even pre-Socratic thinkers. And over the years, the two have come to mesh together. And one of the most binding things was a school of thought known as critical pedagogy, which is a big school of thought that came from a Brazilian theorist by the name of Paulo Freire. And for Freire, his main ideas was that how do we use the popular expressions of the everyday people to elucidate how the dominant culture inseminates ideology, right? So today when we think about hip-hop philosophy, we think about people like scholars who are predominantly scholars, intellectuals, think about how music informs the culture, norms, ideologies of young people in America and across the globe. So a lot of hip-hop philosophy is really sort of how do we think about dominant ideologies? How do hip-hop artists, as artists, create different routes, trajectories to think about the experience of being young, black, female, brown in America and across the globe? So one of the things about the MC as the voice, sits in a tradition of the narrative, the slave narrative, and the autobiography in America, where the voice was a cultural expression for more than just my personal being. So when we think about the philosopher almost has the same cultural voice, right? We think about how societal norms, psychological, cultural norms all inform how the philosopher thinks about their being in the world. And so that, the being in the world is that I'm up against the voices of other people, autonomy of other people, but also the products of other people, right? People produce their own goods, their own iPhones, their own Facebook, and all these things, right, that inform my identity. So my identity is always bouncing up against the fact that the world I live in is populated by other people's voices, ideas, fears, expectations, and how do I come to understand myself in relation to the things outside of myself? So hip-hop philosophy comes from that, right? We think about people like a Jay-Z, a Tupac, or Kanye. How do their voices inform us about the particular regions that they come from, right? Jay-Z comes from Bed-Stuy in New York, right? What does that mean growing up in that region? But also that he's had experiences traveling across the globe, Niggas in Paris, for example. Niggas in Paris could also be an allusion back to the days of the Harlem Renaissance when a lot of writers, the James Baldwins, the Richard Wrights, traveled from America to end up in Paris, and that expression of being black as a transnational and transatlantic experience, right? So a lot of hip-hop philosophy comes from the black experience in America. How have black people attempted to create their own voice against the dominant cultural norms? And over the years, it's been debatable to whether hip-hop has sustained its own voice, whether it's been sort of incorporated into the new systems of dominant philosophies as capitalism has taken over a dominant role in how hip-hop music is inseminated. We talk about the luxury rap of people like a Jay-Z maybe. And do we have counter voices in hip-hop that can still speak to the grassroots, right? Do we have people like Immortal Technique who can talk about the political realities of growing up in America or Latin America and the things that are going on? So hip-hop philosophy is an attempt to think about how do young people in America and across the globe use art forms to talk about their existence in ways where they're marginalized and where they don't have a lot of opportunities to be able to be vocal about those things. Because again, right, the traditional normal channels of political theory have been segregated, or have been such that black people and brown people have been segregated from having those channels to speak through those ways. And so black people have had to find ways to figure out how to best articulate their own voice and using different art forms. And hip-hop has emerged as one field where black people do such a thing. So when you think about hip-hop philosophy, the hip-hop philosopher's job in academia for the most part has been trying to tie history, the practice of being living in America, the theories that inform our identities right now, but also how to be critical about some of the things that go on in hip-hop, right? We don't just take in hip-hop as it is, but we are critical of some of the things that artists have to say. We challenge them as we challenge ourselves to grow, to think more inclusively and deeply about what it means to be human, about oppression, imperialism, and privilege, and how privilege might affect us in different ways. And that's debatable as well. Do black males have privilege in America? Most feminists might say yes, and most scholars might argue no. But all these things are what hip-hop are about, right? That everything we do is a discourse. At the best of hip-hop is a discourse that keeps accountability for the best tradition of a humane society, a society that is just, and and offers different truths to it. And those truths sometimes are ugly, and sometimes they're bearable. But that is the role of the philosopher, that the philosopher is always a gadfly, that all the things that we go through are brought to what we call paideia, an unsettling truth that reinforms our education such that our orientation to the world is more critical about what we inseminate and disseminate. So the best of hip-hop philosophy at best is to keep the legacy of truth-telling and community building.